The story starts off with the main protagonist, Yu Damduk, being interviewed for a job. They proceed to ask him a few questions relating to the job and his motives for applying for the position. He tries to reply as enthusiastically as he can, but the interviewers seem unimpressed by his resume and claim that he has no talent whatsoever. As if that wasn't enough, they further humiliate him, asking him if he doesn't think that this was embarrassing. Shocked, he stares at them blankly and asks what they mean by that. Tapping one of his fingers on the table, one of the interviewers sneers at him, claiming that if he doesn't have any talent, why did he even bother applying to a big corporation like this? It turns out that after the appearance of dungeons in the world, hidden abilities within people surfaced. Due to the talent that people had, civilization developed rapidly. But unfortunately for Yu Damduk, he was found to have no talent at all. He sighed deeply as the interviewers continued to speak harshly toward him, claiming that they had no use for talentless people. Fed up, he boldly says that they were discriminating against talentless people. The interviewer stuttered, seemingly taken aback, before lashing angrily back at him as a last resort. Saying things such as, "We're tired of people like you," and, "Do you think being talentless is a government job?" Yu Damduk was annoyed, leaning forward and propping his hands on his legs. He then continued to ask if expecting proper treatment was conducting himself poorly, before proceeding to demand an apology from the interviewers. Unfazed, the interviewers only stared down at him, telling him that it should be the other way around and that he had to apologize to them instead since he was the one who had wasted their precious time. He stands up and asks if they won't apologize, only to be responded to by them asking him to go first. Pulling out a voice recorder from his pocket, he holds it out in front of him, telling them that the entire conversation had been recorded. Threatening them, he claims that they definitely discriminated against talentless people as well as posted a false recruitment ad for the job. The interviewers finally seemed nervous and claimed that they were only trying to lighten the mood. However, Yu Damduk was not having it. He confidently walked away as they chased after him, saying that they would apologize. He slapped their hands away and glanced back at them, challenging them to say the things they had said before to the Human Rights Committee. The interviewers looked defeated. Walking out of the building, he grumbled angrily, comforting himself that even if he was talentless, at least he had swag. He pulled out his phone and sent a report to the Human Rights Committee. Still annoyed, he continued grumbling as he was walking home, not paying attention to the road. A wet sound came from the ground, and as he looked down he realized he had stepped onto some gum. While he was angrily stomping on the sidewalk to try and get rid of the gum stuck on his shoe, he was suddenly splashed with water. The gardeners that were trying to water the shrubs apologized to him, saying that they did not notice that there was someone there. He was speechless for a while and stared tiredly at the sky, muttering to himself about how bad his day was going. Upon reaching home, he saw that there were stains by the window grill. Crouching beside it, he grumbled about the drunk women who kept doing this. As he called his mother, he grabbed a cloth and quickly wiped the stains from the walls. Sitting down on the floor, he asked his mother if she had eaten and if she was doing well. It turns out that his mother had been hospitalized. On top of that, their family owed a debt due to his uncle borrowing money. He then reassures his mother not to worry and that he was doing well in society. He tells her to not worry about the hospital bills and to take care of herself. Hanging up, he walks out of his room and tries to light a cigarette, lamenting that this was the only thing that could cheer him up. Sadly, this was a very bad day for him. Just as he was lighting his cigarette, it suddenly started raining. He shook in anger, speechless at the turn of events. He threw his lighter angrily on the ground, screaming in frustration, shouting at the sky. He yells that he should at least be allowed this, as his life was hard enough already, and asks why God keeps hindering him. He then slams his fist into the ground, saying that he didn't want to live like this and it wasn't his fault the way things turned out the way it was. Suddenly, lightning flashed in the sky. Squinting at the bright sight, he raised his hand and cursed at the sky once again. Maybe it was because of the fact that his rage was directed toward God, but the lightning landed right on him. As he fell, he thought that he was going to die. He felt as if his life had served no purpose, and was only worried about what would happen to his mother after he was gone. After some time passed, he finally regained consciousness. Groaning faintly, his eyes flickered open. He was surprised that he was still alive. As he sat up, a blue screen appeared before him. Not knowing what it was, he stared at it in confusion. The screen flickered, and a line of words appeared. The gods are awaiting you. Yu Damduk sat in a corner of his room, pondering if the existence of God was real. After swearing at God whom he had never denied not accepted the existence of, he was hit by lightning. Was this heaven's judgment? While most people would already have died from being struck by lightning. Not only was he perfectly fine, but there was not a single scratch on his body. Moreover, there was a constant message that was floating above his head. Yu Damduk was confused and stared at it for a long while. He eventually came to the conclusion that the lightning that had hit him was a talent. Wanting to test it out, he quietly whispered, "Status window." However, the blue window remained unchanged. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed to look like a part-time job notice. As he muttered to himself, a bright flash suddenly came from the blue window. The blue window had transformed into a server. Taken aback, he stared speechlessly at it. Scoffing at it, he remarks that in reality all he could do were part-time jobs, and even now it was all about part-time jobs. Sighing, he tries to convince himself to be more positive. This was all he had anyways, he had nothing to lose. The screen now showed a list of part-time jobs from the gods that he could choose. Glancing at it, he randomly applied for one but was rejected due to the lack of divine power. Bewildered by the sudden error message, he stared at the new screen that had just popped up. Divine power, also known as the energy used by the gods, was needed to apply for certain jobs. And Yu Damduk, who was just starting out, had none. Even though the system was new and unfounded. He saw it as an opportunity to turn his life around. He then nodded to himself and decided to give it a try. After a while of searching, he finally found a job that required no divine power. The job descriptions were relatively simple. It required him to do simple physical work for the creation of a dungeon. Covering his mouth with his hand, Yu Damduk gasped. He had just found out that the so-called dungeons that were appearing all over the world were created by the gods. Looking over at the payment for the work, he noticed that it was in Thor, the currency of the gods. Although he wasn't sure if the currency could be exchanged for their money, he decided to try. Pressing the accept button, he soon found himself being teleported to a foreign area. Glancing around at the nearby scenery, he wondered if he was dreaming, as he had never seen such a place before. Suddenly, a creature jumped out at him from nowhere. It opened its jaws menacingly, preparing to bite him. Just as he thought that he was done for, a hand grabbed the creature's neck. A man hovered over him, laughing as he told the creature to behave itself. He looked down at Yu Damduk and asked if he was the new working. Upon confirming, he introduced himself as Odin's son, the god of thunder, Thor. Smiling, he placed his hands on Yu Damduk's shoulders and hoisted him up as he walked towards the work site. In the midst of thinking about what was going on, Thor suddenly bent down and asked if he was a god from Asia. Looking around, he wondered if it was normal for Thor to see him as a god, as the people here didn't seem like they were humans. Not wanting to seem out of place, he clenched his teeth and quickly came up with a lie, telling Thor that he was a god that came from a small mountain. Thor smacked his hand across his back and laughed loudly, claiming to have heard of mountain gods before and that they were well known to help people in danger. Glancing at Yu Damduk's outfit, Thor commented that he seemed extremely immersed in the human culture. Smiling awkwardly, he waved his hands around and quickly explained that it was so that he could learn about humans. Upon hearing that, Thor promptly asked if he was able to do the job, as he seemed to cherish humans a lot. After all, the job's task was to make a place in which humans would suffer. Yu Damduk looked downwards as he stuttered hesitantly that he could. As the two of them walked towards the entrance of the dungeon, Thor asked him if he had heard about the Minotaur's maze. Nodding his head, he replied that he had, but was confused as to why Thor was asking him this. A bright light flashed as they arrived at the entrance of the dungeon. From where he was standing, Yu Damduk was able to see the workings of the dungeon. Thor waves his hand at it and continues to explain that the concept of the dungeon was based on the Minotaur's maze. Grinning, he looks over at Yu Damduk, telling him that he would be building the maze with them. Yu Damduk was extremely enthusiastic while working. Even when they called for assistance in the middle of a meal, he would always volunteer to go first. Bending down to grab the last crate, he asked his colleague if the work in the area was done. After complimenting Yu Damduk for his hard work, the duo moved on to the next area. On the way there, his colleague mentioned that he was very enthusiastic and wondered if all Asian gods were as enthusiastic as him. Additionally, many compliments about his attitude had already spread from several places about him. Grinning from ear to ear proudly, he nodded and internally praised himself for his social skills. Who cared if he didn't have talent? Socializing with the gods here would definitely bring him great benefits. As they reached their next destination, his colleague mentioned that they should do the work from here on as he didn't want the traps to be triggered by the monster that was pulling the cart. Yu Damduk jumped out of the cart and started moving the crates but was stopped mid-step by a shout from his colleague. He pointed to a sigil on the ground which was a sign of a trap and told him to be careful. While it was his first time seeing this sort of thing, his colleague told him to take this as a learning experience. Moving forward, his colleague commented that only upper-class senior gods required some tests from humans and that low-class gods like them did not have any place for those, and thus they were forced to do these kinds of things for a living. Dungeons were to be created constantly, creating an infinite amount of workload for them. Arriving in the next room, Yu Damduk gasped in awe as he looked upon the huge stone chamber that was built in a mere few minutes. He placed the crate that he was carrying on the ground and stepped aside to let his colleague pry it open. While the box looked like it contained a round-shaped rock, in reality, it was a spider's egg. And by the time the egg started spawning, the dungeon would be a pain in the ass for the hunters. Curiously peeking into another box, Yu Damduk discovered a lizard man lying in it. Fascinated, he reached his hand out to touch it but was warned to be careful as the lizard man had yet to complete its embodiment. It turns out that the part he was about to touch was its vital spot. As they moved to the next room, his colleague explained that it was a goblin hiding shelter. When the humans reached this room, they would be close to the final destination, the boss room. Shivering, Yu Damduk commented it was really cold as he turned back to glance at something that had caught his eyes. A shadow lurking in the darkness suddenly jumped out at him. He screamed for his life and fell onto the ground. The shadow turned out to be a goblin. It cackled with laughter as it pointed at Yu Damduk. It turns out that a goblin was merely messing around with him. It would be a completely different story once the dungeon was completed. Reaching the end of the labyrinth, they stood in front of the boss's door. Just as they were admiring the gate, Thor appeared and called out to him. Telling him that he had heard a lot of compliments concerning him, he asked about how his work was going. His colleague explains that they were only left with the last procedure and that they were more or less done. Grinning, Thor pulls out his hammer. Looking at it fearfully, Yu Damduk stuttered and asked why he was doing that. Thor merely laughed and bid goodbye to him as he brought his hammer down onto him. Screaming, he covered his head with his hands. Cowering on the ground, he found himself back at his house. Sighing in relief, he exclaimed that they had such a wild way of sending people off work. Tears of joy poured out of his eyes as he finally realized that he had awakened and gained a real talent. For the first time in his life, he finally felt fulfilled. Suddenly a message popped up from the blue screen, telling him that his salary had been paid. His hands shook as he pressed the screen. A message popped up and said that it was loading the god's shop.